3, 2, 1.
Hello there, Chris from Rocket Lasso. I have got a new tutorial, a primer in fact, on using field forces inside of Cinema 4D. Now, field forces are incredibly powerful. They're integrated into a bunch of different places inside of Cinema, and they're really deep. I think it's the deepest tool that's been added in the Cinema for a while. But with that depth, with this complexity, means it's a little difficult to make tutorials for it because everybody's use case for this is going to be completely unique to the project that you're working on. So along those lines, kind of like Espresso, you just kind of need to learn the nodes. You need to learn the way that these different ingredients might combine so you can make whatever you want to make. And that is the goal behind this video. It's about an hour long, and we're going to be covering a bunch of kind of tips and tricks I've learned, basic use cases, ways of thinking about the field forces to try and make it so you can build your own rigs and your own setup so that you have complete control over whatever it is that you're trying to build. So why don't we dive right on in? Here we are in R21. Of course, you need to be in R21 to use field forces because that is when they were introduced. We find them by going to Simulate, Forces, and here we are in the Forces menu, and there is Field Force. We are going to be comparing them to these other ones quite a bit. So let's start by creating a field force. And we're not going to see much to start out. We just kind of got this bounding box. And we are currently in the Object tab. Now, this is very important. I have sometimes accidentally found myself in the Fall Off tab, and I'll be tinkering around and be like, hey, why isn't this working? Because we have a field parameter here, and in the Object tab, we have a field parameter. So it's easy to get those mixed up. Just make sure you're in the Object tab. Otherwise, it's not going to behave the way you think it will. Now, we are not seeing much here. Let's start by trying to see something going on. I am going to create a field layer that we don't use too often. That is a solid. If we click on solid, it's going to create that. And now we can see these little lines in a cube, in a nice grid formation. These lines have colors and they have a direction. Now, what is a solid? A solid is just a vector. It's it can be a color, but in terms of Cinema 4D, it just means we have kind of three parameters in one. We have X, Y, and Z. So this is being treated as a direction in this case. So we can point them in different directions. So here is X, Y, and Z. It's pointing up on Y. Let's zero that out and instead change our direction to be 1 on X. And now you can see they turn red like our X and they are facing in that orientation. What's cool about the solid is it is going to behave just like a wind behaves. So we've now recreated the wind force just by creating a solid. So we get a direction, and we can change the direction. I can say -1. It's going to turn to the opposite color, blue, and it's going to be facing to the right. It's going to be facing left on the left and right axis. But we can combine these. I can add a 1 on Y as well. We're going to get this 45-degree angle. We can set it to all three, and we're going to be getting 45s on every angle, and they all get combined in this perfect wind, and we didn't even have to rotate anything. So it's really fun using the solid. In addition to that, let's put these to 0, 0, and we can crank them up as well. Let's go ahead and increase our direction to 2 on Y, and you see the line gets twice as long. So not only is this showing us the direction via color and the orientation of the line, but it's also showing us the power of that particular area, that spot, by scaling up the line. Now, this line is controlled via the display tab. So let's click over to the display tab in our field force. And we got a couple of key settings here. One of them is line density. That is how many samples are being created. Currently, it's sampling 10% of them. I'm going to crank this up, and you can go all the way to 100%. You see that gets a little bit crazy pretty quick. Now, this is not a super intuitive way, for me at least, to be viewing this field force because it's giving us too much information. Especially, let's go back to our Object tab. Let's create a different field. I'm going to create a random field. So I'm going to create random field. I'm going to turn off our solid. We got our random field. I'm going to set that to normal so it's completely overriding. So you can see that this has got these little tick marks and they're all facing in random directions. And before I forget, I'm just going to visually hide that because I don't like seeing this extra box if we don't have to. So in our display tab, as I crank this up, you see we get all of these tick marks. And you can see we kind of get a vibe for there being a little bit of a noise pattern in there, but it's very difficult to see. So what I really like to do is to grab our box size, and we got X, Y, and Z. I'm going to grab Z, and I'm going to set it from 200 to 0. And at 0, we're just getting a single slice. Now, we get the advantage of this is calculating a lot less samples, and we're getting a better visual representation of exactly what's going on. Now, what's cool, we're going to jump back and forth between these tabs a little bit. What's cool is we are using a random field. And what's great about the random field is by default in I think R20 and 21, the random mode is set instead of to random, it's set to noise. And in noise mode, we get access to all the amazing Cinema 4D noises, which is wonderful. And we get the default Perlin, which is the old noise. So better named now. Now we can grab this, we can change the scale, this can go up and down. Now what's so great about this is in the past, we would be using turbulence. I loved using the simulate forces turbulence. We use this for lots of different things. But you'll see if I move this off to the side, it gives us no feedback. All the time when we are using that, we'd be changing the scale. And I always said, like, imagine it like a big cloud of three-dimensional noise. But as we changed the scale, it didn't really mean much to us. It was always like, oh, if we go to about 250, it was a good scale. And then 0 means like complete randomness. Let's delete that. Now our field force with this random field inside of it is giving us that same effect, mostly the same effect. It's not exactly the same, but we get this perfect feedback on exactly what the scale of that noise is. So that part automatically is pretty wonderful. Now we are, so let's go back to our display tab and check out some additional features. Now we've got a setting called display vector length. Let's just cover this right now. If we go back and go to our overall velocity, you can see we got different directions and we even have different strengths. But if we go and we start cranking up our overall strength here, I'm going to start cranking this up. You're going to see this is going to very quickly, as we increase the power, it's going to explode to something that's a lot harder to see. I want to be able to see that a little bit better. So what I could do in this instance is go back to our display tab, and what I typically do is I'll go to my scale display length and I'll set this to something smaller. I'm going to set it to like 0.1. So it's now showing 1/10 of the scale. And the reason I like doing that is I like getting that scale feedback from my lines here. But an alternative mode, instead of just scaling them to something, and you could scale them up, we can make them bigger, we can make them smaller, go back to default by right-clicking. But we could also change our line length. We can change the length as, instead of being length, we can set it to brightness. And now it's going to change the color based on how powerful they are. And we lose all the color information, but we already get that information via the direction. So this is another valid mode where they're always this set length no matter how powerful they are. So if I were to crank up the strength more and more and more, that doesn't change at all. So an important additional variable. For right now, I'm going to leave it on line length just so we can get some nice feedback that way. And I'm going to reset our strength back to its default. Cool, I just wanted to cover some of those. Now, let's go ahead and start introducing some objects into our scene here. I've actually got a layer hidden. I'm going to bring these in, and I've got just a couple objects that can be affected. So what can field force affect? Well, everything that Cinema 4D's forces could always affect, but let's just recap those real quick. I'm going to grab this plane object, pull it out, turn it on. I've just got a couple subdivisions here. I'm going to make it editable so that we can add a simulation cloth onto it. Now, immediately in the cloth, I'm going to go to forces and I'm going to go to my gravity and get rid of the gravity. I don't want any gravity. Now, we've got the field force turned on. I'm going to hit play, and with no gravity, it's just going to begin deforming it. It's deforming it just like you expect a turbulence to. And it's kind of deforming it in the same way, in the same pattern that the noise is. You can see we got the scale of about this circle. You can kind of draw little circles around these distinct areas, and that's about the size of the deformation that's happening. As we change the scale of our random field here, let's shrink this way down. We don't have too much resolution on our cloth, but if I hit play, we're going to see them be affected a little bit more individually. And of course, if we crank our scale way up and make it really big, it's going to start behaving a lot more uniformly. Make this even bigger. So now it's huge, and these are going to want to behave in very similar ways. You can see how the scale is dramatically affected. Directly controlled via the scale. So reset that back to default by right-clicking. And okay, so that's cloth. Works perfectly there. We can add a simulation soft body. The effect is not going to be so extreme here because cloth doesn't want to bend as much. So if I play, we won't see too much of an effect. It will move, but inside of our field force, I'm going to crank this up to 55, 10 times as strong. Let's see if we see it. Not so much. Crank it up to 10 times as strong again. It's a little hard to see, but let's hit play. And now you can see it starts getting deformed really strongly. Now, reset that back to default. We don't need to see it nearly that strong. So that is affecting a plane with some regular old dynamics. I don't think we need it anymore, so I'm going to delete it. Now, it can also affect emitters. So the old school Cinema 4D emitters. I'm going to turn on this emitter. Currently, I have it set to be emitting 100 particles per refresh here, per frame. And I increase the life. If I hit play, they're going to start emitting. I'm actually going to set the speed down to 0. So now they're being emitted with no speed, but we should start seeing them flying around a little bit right there. So they're getting their speed, and it's behaving a lot like turbulence. Yeah, they're getting their speed from their field force. Excellent. And lastly, in this circumstance, I'm going to create a cloner, and let's add a rigid body. I got rigid body applied. Ooh, important variable here. Let's pause that. I'm going to hit Control or Command if you're on a Mac. D for project settings. Go to your dynamics, go to General, and set your gravity down to 0. By default, it's at 1000. I'm setting it to 0. So the only effect we're seeing, of course, is our field force. So with that, I can play, and they all start blowing around in the wind to the random. Excellent. So that is behaving perfectly. There's also the field force node now inside of Espresso, so you can use it with thinking particles. But we're not going to worry about thinking particles. That's a little bit more advanced. All right, so we got some more stuff to talk about in the basics of the field force, and mainly that is to do with its velocity type and its strength. So right now, let's turn off our random field and turn on our solid. So it's just a full-on direction. And I'm going to take this direction, 0 out on Y. Let's blow it on Z. So I'm going to say 1 on Z. So you see we get all these facing along Z. Excellent. So if I play, we're going to see them start moving along. Now, just for an example, let's go turn on our random again, turn off solid, and hit play. You see these will be blowing around, but I'm going to jump up to, let's say, 55. 55 is a very reasonable amount. You can see they're moving around in a controlled type of way. Excellent. So 55 is not too fast. So if we turn off random, go back to solid. Once again, our lines are getting in the way. So we could go back to our display mode and set this down to 0.1 if we still want that feedback. And of course, we can set the brightness, and now those won't be visually getting in the way. Hit play, and you can see that these are going to start accelerating away. But not only that, they're accelerating and getting faster and faster as they go. You see it starts going zoom, and they're going to fly out of the scene, and they're going faster and faster and faster. And that's because this field force is adding 55 strength every single frame. So they are accelerating. Now, I don't think wind quite behaves that way. Wind does accelerate, but I guess it does behave a lot like the force wind in here. But that's cool that we're getting all this velocity, but we got to keep in mind how we need to control that. This is going to be constantly adding more and more force with this type of wind. We probably don't want it like that. So what we need to do is have some way of draining energy out from the system. There's two main ways that I know of to drain energy out from the system. We can go into the actual dynamics if you're in using Cinema's dynamics. And under the force tab, we have something called damping, linear damping. And this is a way of draining energy out from your dynamics. Now, they changed the defaults from 0 to 5, I think in R20 or R21. And it's draining a little bit of energy out, but no, not that much. Now, when it comes to damping in dynamics, I feel like you don't see any effect until we get to about 90%. At 90%, if I hit play, this is going to be blowing forward, but you see it's not going insane with the acceleration. It actually seems like it's quite linear. We can actually crank this up to like 99% if we wanted to, and that's going to be draining quite a bit of the energy out. And here's the tricky thing with damping is at 100%, it's like so strong that it just stops everything dead. But at 99%, it's still going to be moving quite a bit. So you want to stay below 100%, but you can't go up to like 99.9, 99.99, and it's going to keep on draining out more and more energy, but don't go above 100. But in any case, you see at like 95, it's draining out enough energy where it's not going insane. It's not accelerating out of nowhere. And this is important because if we want to be constantly applying more force, we also have to be draining it out somehow. I'm going to reset this damping to 0 and we'll take a look back to default of 5. We can also drain the energy out by going to simulate forces friction. So with friction, this is going to be draining energy out the same way. And what's cool about friction is also going to be applying to particles as well as cloth dynamics and regular soft bodies and rigid bodies. So you can see that it's kind of the same. It's draining out a lot of energy. We can crank this up to 100 and drain tons of energy out. And let's go back to 10. At 10, you'll see if I turn off my field force, it's going to almost immediately slow down to slow down to 0 eventually. So only when we're constantly adding energy back into the system is that going to be getting applied. Now, this is going to be very important for a lot of the systems we build later on. So I just want to really kind of hammer home how important it is, the concept of adding to the velocity and draining those forces out via friction or via damping. So turn off friction. And let's go zoom in our object and talk about some other types. So next up, this is add to velocity, but next up would be set absolute velocity. So I'll set it to that. Friction is off, damping isn't doing anything, not anything relevant. And now with absolute velocity, I can hit play. And this is going to begin moving forward at a constant rate. Whatever we set this number to, let's do 155, it's going to move at exactly that speed. 555, drop this down to 5. We have very direct control. It's just absolutely setting it to this speed at that direction, which is pretty neat. It's a mode that I kind of wish we had in some of the other ones. There are definitely times when you would want to be using this mode. So we'll go to 155 and let's just look at the way it behaves. So that's moving forward at constant rate. Very nice. Even if we turn on friction, it's going to have no effect because it's being set to an absolute speed. So it might drain all the energy out, but then the field force is saying, nope, add this amount of force back in again. Now, if we go into our field force and turn off solid and turn on random, and the random's a little small right now, so I'm going to increase it. If we hit play on here, you're going to see a very different type of behavior. As I hit play, these are going to move, but they're going to kind of find an equilibrium pretty quickly. And what's important to point out here is when we're using a random noise, there are actually these points of equilibrium, essentially trap points where this is pointing one direction and then these would be pointing a different direction, and there could be almost like a little gravity well in the middle. And these are all quickly finding those gravity wells. Instead of getting blown away, they're getting sucked in, and that's where they get trapped, which is pretty neat. But it's a very different behavior if we used add to velocity, in which case they're kind of accelerating in there, and it's a lot harder for them to get trapped. You can see a lot of them are flying around, although some are still getting trapped. We'll be able to work around that in some different ways, but it's just something important to know, and you can see how very different those two behaviors are. So this is set to absolute velocity, a lot more stable of a velocity type. The last mode is change direction. And what this is going to do is take whatever our current velocity is and just pick a new direction, never change its speed. So if I play, nothing is going to happen. But inside of dynamics, if I were to go to dynamics tab, turn on custom initial velocity, we're going to say, hey, you're a speed at the beginning. Let's turn off the field force just to show this. Let's have them fly off on Z. So I'm going to say, hey, on Z, you're going to be traveling at, let's say, 555. So if I hit play, let's see. Okay, you see they kind of burst out in that direction. It's a little fast. Let's try 333. So they're going to blast off in that direction. Now, if we turn our field force on, it has a direction set. So if I hit play, they're immediately going to jump to these final positions because that was the speed that they were traveling at. Now, they collided with each other. And when they collide with each other, they're draining energy out from the system, and then they eventually stop, except for the ones that didn't collide with something. And now it's being set to its full speed, but it's going to one vector and then another, and it's just going to keep on oscillating. So this would probably be a good situation in that we could also add a friction, because that will slowly drain the energy out from it, and these will slow themselves down. So now that they have an initial velocity, they can blast into this final position. This particular noise isn't being super useful for what it's doing, but if we were to grab our field force and grab our random noise and grab maybe some animation speed into it, I'm going to jump this up to about 100 and hit play, then these can start traveling, and well, I guess in this case they will still get trapped, but you see how very different this combination of different velocity types is going to be when we change between add to, set absolute, and change direction. So that covers all of the super basics when it comes to using the field force object. But now we're going to start getting into some of the most useful ways of using it. So now the goal is to walk through some of the most useful things to do with field forces. And I would love to start out by largely recreating some of the other effects that we get in our regular forces. In this case, namely the attractor. So I'm going to create an attractor. We're going to turn it off for a second. And I don't want the friction. I don't want the field forces. We're not going to use the cloner, but I am going to use the emitter. So we'll turn on the emitter. And here's what we're going to do. If I play right now, it's going to be emitting particles, but they're not moving anywhere. Let's go ahead and create way more particles. I'm going to add 10 times or 100 times as many. So we got 10,000 particles, 0 speed, and I'm going to stop emitting after 5 frames. So what we should get is a burst of particles, and they just exist there. They're not moving. They're just stuck. Excellent. So with that in mind, let's turn on our attractor. With this attractor turned on, hit play. It's going to be pulling in the particles from really far away. In fact, I want to exaggerate this even more. I'm going to grab our emitter, and under the X size, we're going to double. Actually, let's go to 500 by 500. So it's pretty big. So now we've got this attractor. We're not getting any feedback from the attractor. If we hit play, you're going to see that the particles in the center are being pulled a lot, and the particles on the edge are barely being affected. There's some sort of like exponential fall off that naturally happens with an attractor. And in some ways that's good. It means it's behaving a little bit more like the real world, like gravity far away is not as strong as gravity that's close up. But you automatically get some problems that we're seeing. First of all, we don't have a lot of control over this. When they get to the center point, it's almost like they're getting this infinite energy applied, and they're flinging out into space, so you always have to add in a fall off to stop them from exploding from the center point. They're just not that controllable. It can be a little bit of a pain. I'm going to delete the attractor, and let's instead use our field force. I'm going to grab our emitter. Let's set the size back to default. Right click again to actually 200 is what I want. So 200 to match our overall shape. And in our field force, I'm going to set our let's go to display and go back to line length so we see the colors, and put the line length scale back to 1. Excellent. Now, in our field force object tab, make sure we're on object. I'm going to turn off random. Don't need to see that. And let's rewind all the way. And what do we want to play with? Well, let's keep it simple. We're going to build that attractor. So we'll create a spherical field. Currently it's set to max. I'm immediately going to set to normal. That just means that it is going to be it's just the only thing of having any effect. And currently our velocity type is set to change direction. I'm going to set it to add to velocity. And of course our strength is up to 155, which is pretty big. I'm going to right click, set back to 0. So hopefully I didn't lose anybody. It's pretty much a brand new field force with a spherical field applied. Cool. So once again, let's look at this default. If I play, you can see our particles get generated. Now let's turn on our field force. You can see everything's going to get pulled in the middle. But right away, you'll see a couple differences. First of all, they're not exploding out with a ton of energy and flying out to infinity. So good start right there. It's a little more controllable. After another instant nice addition is we have this nice little radius set here. So we can actually see exactly where things are getting applied. So if it's not inside the circle, it's not being affected at all. Now, we've got so many more things we can directly control here that makes it so much more useful. One is if we click on our spherical field, we can click on it here, or via the field force in the object tab, we can click on spherical field and see the same exact settings here. It's changing the same parameters. We have our fall off, our remapping. Inside of here, we can change things like our inner offset. I can give this a full range of inner offset, and it's going to have a really nice clean fall off where it's stronger in the center and weaker on the outside. So you can see how it's slow. It's more powerful in the middle and slowly fall off. Similar to the attractor, except I think this is linear, where that was some sort of exponential fall off. So that works well. But then immediately we have an invert box. That's pretty interesting. Let's turn that on, and we'll immediately see what's happening here is everything is being affected. Everything's being pulled into the center, but it kind of falls off as it gets near that center point. So if I hit play, you're going to see that they're going to, actually, this will be really neat. I'm going to increase my sphere until it's big enough so the fall off is covering the entire rectangle here. And what should happen, I'm going to turn off the field force temporarily. Our particles get created. Now when I turn it on, there's a fall off here. So as they all get pulled in, look at that neat pattern that happens, but they're all approaching that center point almost at the same time, just by inverting the direction, giving it a full fall off. So pretty neat instant pattern that we're getting here. So inverting, very fun to play around with. So now we get this big spherical fall off. Everything's getting pulled into the center, working very nicely. But of course we grab our inner offset and crank it up all the way, and now it's full power anywhere in this circle. So now when I hit play, everything's moving at full power immediately, and they all get pulled towards the center. And they get there at the same power. They get there when they get there. So that works quite nicely as well. If we give this the full range, of course, we can go down to contour. And in the contour, I'm going to change this to a curve, which will give us a spline to represent the fall off. And you see it visually represented here. But we could go and give it more of like a visually exponential fall off. So it's going to be really weak outside and then ramp up really powerfully in the center. You can see it visually represented, but now I hit play. So you see almost no effect on the outside, but pretty strong in the middle. So working nicely. Put that back to none, and let's see some other things we might be able to do. Well, first of all, right now everything's getting attracted to the center, which is neat, but something that's cool is if we go into the direction of the spherical field, we have an invert direction checkbox. Now, interestingly, it's actually set to invert direction by default, but if I turn that off, the colors all invert, and now instead of it being an attractor, it is a pusher. Everything's getting repulsed away and pushing away the opposite direction that it had been traveling before. So pretty neat there. If we turn that back on again, we also have our scale, and every field that we add in here, this is actually an independent power ratio. Currently the scale is at 100, so it's applying 100% of this strength, but we could crank this up to 200, 200, and it's double the strength, so it's going to be double that original value, so everything's going to travel in twice as fast. Now, that gets important when we start combining multiple ones, but for now, I also want to show you that we could grab the spherical field, just grab the little handle here and change it directly. We can also T for scale and scale that down. And of course, we can change its radius. All of these, the size, all of these are doing the exact same thing. But of course, we shrink this down, hit play, and we have control. We can grab this and move it. This is not, it's not stuck. So if we hit E for move, I can move this around. And wherever we move, this is a moving attractor. We can affect those particles as we travel to those individual positions. So, working as we'd expect, but very, very nice. T for scale this up a bit, and let's start combining these. I'm going to make a second spherical field. Let's just go ahead and name it spherical field 2. Why not just name this one 1 to be a little bit clean. Inside our field force, let's make sure we drag our second spherical field in. It's going to be set to normal by default. I can scoot this off to the side, and we have 2 of them. We can see exactly the direction how these are interacting. So when we create our particles, we can see that they're going to kind of fight over these middle ones, and they'll curve over, they'll shoot around, and they're even able to exchange the particles as they go. And something that's cool is because we're working on this perfectly flat emitter with no speed, everything's remaining 2-dimensional, which is pretty cool. Now we can move these around, and they'll interact in whichever way that they want to. But of course, these can start getting combined in some additional ways. We can... Right now it's set to normal. I think if we set it to add, it's pretty much exactly the same. Well, I guess they're adding their strength together a little bit. So there's a little bit of a difference, but visually that's not terribly different. We can multiply them by each other. And what happens in this case is only where when you multiply, you're taking the top value and saying, hey, you can only exist if I exist. But it's kind of like multiplying them on top of each other. So this only has a value in that circle. That only has a value within this circle. So the only place where both of them have value is in the center, so only where they're combined is there any fall off. So you're going to get this pretty interesting weird pattern on that. It's just to show that you can combine these in some pretty interesting ways. In addition to that, we can add an overlay. A lot of these won't do too much, but we can do something. Let's set that back to normal, and I'm going to grab our bottom spherical field, and we can add a mask. This was also added in R21. I'm going to add a mask to it, and I'm going to mask it off via the second spherical field. So now this is still being attracted only to that center point, but where that circle is applied is only where this one is masking it. So you're going to see these still... It looks like I did the order backwards, but you can see that this one is still getting attracted to the center, but only something that's falling within this mask could be applied. So that is why we get that effect. So you can see all the complex ways that these might start getting combined. Of course, you can make as many of these as you want. We can make more and more spherical fields, combine them in all sorts of different ways. We can set one to an attractor. I think if we set one subtract here, it actually takes away from the max. So one is an attractor, one is a repulsor. They can get combined in so many amazing ways. And this is just using a simple spherical field, and you can start seeing the potential of all the ways that those can combine. Now, this might also be behaving as a primer on regular fields, not just field forces, but the field concept if you haven't played with those in R20 as well. But these can start combining in some really crazy ways. I'm going to delete this second spherical field that we created, and I grab the first one, T for scale that down pretty small, and inside of the field force we have something called modifier layers, and you can use these to remap a bunch of different parameters. They're really cool, and you got something like the delay, which can add springiness or smoothness to things, but in this case I'm going to create a decay effect And I'm going to crank this up to, let's go up to 98. I found if you go up to 100%, it can get a little bit weird. But what the decay is doing is kind of remembering what the value used to be. And because we're not up at 100%, it's slowly fading away. But just by doing that, if I hit play and I grab our spherical field, which I'm going to zero out, by the way, reset PSR button, I'm going to hit E and move it just on Y and X. As I click this and move it around, you can see that we're leaving a tail behind anywhere that we travel. It's remembering that value, and the particles are kind of getting sucked along that trail a little bit. You can imagine all the crazy applications for this kind of thing. This could be traveling through a star field, or it could be going through some sort of gaseous cloud. Like, the combinations would be insane. And you could even imagine when we were sort of masking this thing out, that you could instead say the mask should be decaying and remembering that tail, but always be getting attracted directly to where this spherical field is, where the center of the attractor is. So those kind of combinations can get like just absolutely insane. We're not going to go too deep on it because those kind of applications are very dependent on what you're working on, but it's really fun all the different ways these things combine. Let's look at objects that aren't field objects now. Let's do a little cleanup inside of our field force. We don't need any of these things really. We can always just bring them back in. I'll keep them there in case we want to pull them back in, but for now those can be off. All right, so let's start out by bringing in some geometry. We're going to keep this really clean to start out with, and we'll get a little fancier later on. I'm just going to bring in a platonic because it's a very clean, simple shape. T for scale it down just a bit. And in the field force, let's drag this in. The instant we drag it in, we are going to see an effect. We get these nice little circles on the corner. That's because as we drag it in, it is brought in by default, and we have to go to layer. It's brought in as a point object. So that means it's just viewing every single point on the object, and it's creating a essentially spherical radius on the edge. So we could increase the radius, shrink the radius. If we take our object, hit R for rotate, as I spin it and the different points come into contact with our surface there, you're going to see that that is applying an effect. Perfect, exactly what we'd expect with that. So we could change the radius, increase or decrease. We could go into, well, let's go ahead and change the mode because that one's working pretty straightforward. We can go to surface, and now we've got the surface. Now this one takes a lot longer to calculate. We've got such a simple object, we're not really going to see the effect of calculation, but as you add more and more polygons, this one will take longer and longer. It's also the fanciest of all of these. Let's change our display mode. I'm going to hit NG so we can see through our wireframe here. And we can actually see that it is creating a radius on the inside and outside of wherever the surface is. And keep in mind, we're just viewing a slice of this. It's actually a three-dimensional object traveling all the way through everywhere. That's where the calculations will happen. But it's applying everywhere. What's neat is it's essentially just creating a radius that's going in and out. But let's see how this is actually affecting things. If I hit play, we're going to see that the particles created are going to appear everywhere, and they're going to get pushed away from the surface. Inside, they're going to be bouncing around. If we start increasing the radius, they're going to affect more and more things. These will get bounced around on the inside. Those will bounce around on the outside. So pretty neat there. We can shrink this up. An important thing to note is when it comes to all these types of fall-offs, we can always go back into our remapping and completely change the way this is affecting things. First of all, we could say invert. It'll affect everything except for those areas. We can also change our contour mode to curve, and we could affect the spline to change that way the fall-off looks. Even keeping it in the simplest mode, we can just grab our inner offset, and we can change this fall-off and say full strength anywhere it's touching, or do that fall off. So at full strength everywhere, we can just see that where those lines are, that's where it's getting applied. So perfect, exactly as I think we would expect it to behave. There's a couple of extra settings when it comes to surface though. Inside of surface, we can restrict the effect. Right now it's not restricted at all, but we can restrict it to the inside, so the outside's not being calculated. So these will bounce around inside of there. Now, this could be useful for lots of different reasons. If we were to go to our direction, just like we were talking about with the other, like the spherical field rather, we can invert the direction. So now anything that enters inside of this, it's going to get pushed away. In fact, if we increase our layer to go really big, so it's kind of affecting everything in there, you'll see as I grab my object and I start moving around, as anything kind of penetrates the surface of this geometry, it's going to shove it away. Now, this isn't full collision. There's no way of directly doing that when it comes to working directly on the surface of this type of geometry and particles, but it's pretty good, and there's some really neat effects we might be able to get from that. But let's go even further. Let's shrink this radius. So that's inside. We can say outside, exactly what we expect. It's the opposite. Keep in mind at any point, we could always go to our remapping and invert this. So this would actually affect everywhere except for that little fall off. So a lot of powerful combinations. And then our restrict effect, we can also do inside and invert, which is maybe there's a specific purpose for it, but it's on the inside, but instead of the radius making it appear, it's actually making it disappear. So it's kind of the inverted effect, but I'm pretty sure you could just get that by saying inside and inverting it. So maybe it's useful, but I haven't found a specific use for it. So this calculates really nice. Like I said, the more geometry we put on, the longer this will take to calculate. Set this to none. It's going to go inside and out. We are calculating the surface. Let's see if we can get it to slow down a little bit. I'm going to grab our platonic here, and I'm going to start increasing our segments. And let's keep an eye on our FPS here. So it's dropped down to 73. Let's increase our segments some more. And then you can see it's dropped down to 35. Now, this is a decent amount of geometry, but it's not crazy. And you can see just by adding this in, we are getting a significant slowdown on our frames per second. So important to keep in mind. But another concept I want to keep hammering home here is the importance of masks. And right now, this is calculating on the surface, so it's taking a really long time. But look, we created all this extra geometry. If we change this over to point mode, visually, it's not terribly different. And let's just say we wanted anything within this fall off to have some sort of effect. We could, in our field force, drag in our random field again and make sure we turn it on. As we get this random field, it's applying everywhere, but let's turn on a mask. So we'll add a mask to our random field. Inside of the mask, we'll drag our object. So now we're applying this randomness only to these edges. Now we highly subdivided our object. The surface, we saw how slow our FPS was going, but now we're saying, hey, just calculate based on the points and affect the randomness, and you'll see that our FPS is significantly higher. It's just that much quicker to calculate based on the points rather than the surface. So this could be really useful. Now you can see randomness essentially along all the edges because our point count is high enough, and it's just masking everything out. The mask concept, very important. So we'll drag that shape out again, and let's tinker with the last mode here. In fact, we do not need all these subdivisions, so I'm going to get rid of them. Our final mode is volume, and this is actually looking at the overall volume of the shape, and we were just talking about the masks, so I guess I shouldn't have gotten rid of the random field. We'll bring it back in, and the volume, you'll see, is not returning anything, and that's because it's just the volume. It doesn't know what direction it should be. So if we were to do something like take the random field, once again put a mask, drag this in as a volume, we can say, hey, any effect that we're doing, in this case the random field, we can mask it inside, or of course we could go to remapping and invert that so we can be masking the inside or the outside of any geometry. So single-handedly, that makes this pretty powerful, even if it's a very specific use. The idea that this mask could be applied to anything else is kind of powerful. Now, as I said, this is simple geometry. We are going to get a little bit fancier later on, but that should complete this one for now. We'll delete that, and let's jump to splines. I want a circle, but I always use an end side instead of a circle because we have very direct control. T for scale, grab the end side, increase the number of sides so we have quite a few, just a lot. Actually, I'll go even higher just to make it nice and smooth, and we know exactly what we're getting. So inside of our field force, don't need the random field quite yet. We'll get back to it. Let's drag in our spline. So the spline comes in, and we got a couple different settings right away. And this is actually, I think, one of the more confusing things. If you can harness the power of splines, I think it's actually where field forces gets the most powerful. But it's one of the less intuitive ones. So first of all, you're going to see that we get, just by adding the circle, and we're actually getting this whole kind of radial thing. But not only is it radial, you can see the directions that this is facing. The arrows are aligning with the spline, but they're also fading out. You can see that we're full strength here, and as it goes around to get weaker, weaker, weaker until it's down to 0. If we were to create some particles here, you're going to see that those are going to flow around really quickly. These are pretty much not going to move at all, and they're all going to spiral away. Pretty neat that we can do that type of spiral. But, okay, why does it do this? Well, it's because we are currently in a long mode. We've got spline shape, and we can mask things out with that. I tend not to tinker with that too much, although it's probably pretty useful. But for the usefulness on this part, we're going to focus on staying on a long mode. And what's happening is we are traveling from one spot to another, and we can actually change our start and end range. But what I have found is if we just grab our offset and we crank that all the way up to 100, then this is now full power all the way around. That's all we have to do. Grab that from 0, go up to 100. Now we see the entire thing. You actually fade it out to 0 or all the way up, but this is where it starts behaving kind of the way you expect it to. So you play, and now everything wants to travel along this spline. Okay, that's something that's pretty cool. We get that spiral. We could start making it significantly more interesting, though, if let's delete out this end side from our field, and I'm going to create instead an arc. So we get this arc shape, and let's see, where is it? Our arc is right there. It's outside. It's a little bit big, so I'm going to shrink it down, and let's scoot this over here, a little bit more into the middle. Now, in our field force, we're going to drag our arc, and the same problem happens, but we know how to fix that now. We can just click on the arc, crank up offset. Now you see we got full strength here. So it's actually traveling the length of this. If we hit play, it's going to take all the particles and make them travel along that spline. But there's a couple things we need to keep in mind. First of all, they're all traveling that way. Let's say we wanted to go the opposite way. Two main ways to fix that. One, you can go into almost every type of spline, and there's usually a reverse checkbox. So I can turn on reverse. You see it's going to invert the colors, and now they're going to travel the opposite way. Now, the next thing we're going to notice is that it's traveling the spline, but it's kind of flinging it off into nowhere. Why is that? Well, that goes back to some of the other ways we had been using this. When it comes to our velocity type, we're currently adding to the velocity. So as this particle travels upward, it starts slowly getting additional forces telling it to go fly to the left, but it still has all of that upward velocity. So as long as no energy is being drained out from the system, it's going to continue traveling upward. So nothing's going to slow that down. So in order to slow it down, the best way when it's in particles is we would need to use this friction. So we'll just turn that same friction that we've had forever on, and that should drain energy out from the particle. So now we're going to see it does a much better job of traveling, although not perfect. So let's crank up our strength. I'm going to go to 100, and now it's draining a lot of energy out from the system. And now as it travels up, so much energy is drained that you see it very much following that surface. Now we end up with a very interesting final shape, but it did travel that spline. So not too bad there. We have to keep some additional things in mind, though. Like that's using our friction. But if we had set this to something like changing the type to set absolute velocity, then all of those are going to start traveling perfectly along that. We crank this up, and you're going to see, well, first of all, the field objects, I'm going to just visually turn that off for a second. You're going to see that this is going to travel up perfectly, but of course this is full power all of the time, so that might not always be what we want. And if our particles were flowing around a little bit already, then of course we could set it to change direction. The current rig that we have set up, we're not going to be able to see that very well. As these are created with 0 speed, we have to give them some speed. Just as an experiment, let's go ahead and give it their default speed. They should travel forward and immediately get a direction change. So let's hit play and see what we get. And yeah, it does work. So they're born with a certain speed, and they're going to continue with that speed, whatever their current speed is. But what's cool is that you could influence this with other things. We could do different fallouts. We could add friction that can actually still slow down. You see this will drain them down quite quickly. Set this to 10 so it's not quite as powerful, and these will travel and slowly lose their energy. You see they're traveling along the spline, though. Now, I will say that if we go back to our field force here and go back to add to velocity, and we'll slow that back down again, so we're kind of back to our defaults. It's traveling the spline, but it's not very intuitive visually. And this is us simplifying. This is us in the 2D mode. But if I were to grab this arc and hit T for scale, shrink it down even further, you see it doesn't really change the effect that much. Everything from this line is infinitely trying to travel to the left. Everything down here is infinitely trying to travel up. This all the way down to infinity. And this arc, this curving arc, is actually going to go out also for infinity traveling out there. If I kept on increasing the scale of our box, and let's just do that right here. As I start increasing, you see that it's still calculating out to infinity. So with that in mind, I feel like visually this isn't necessarily what you're expecting. Now, inside of our field force, we can actually make it a lot more controllable, and there might be different workflows for this, but what I found is we actually, let's just keep all of that in mind. It goes out to infinity. Now, inside of our arc, we have another main mode that we can play with. We have a distance mode along. Let's change it to radius mode. So we're going to change it to a radius, and what happens now is, we should scale up our arc again. What's happening now is it is pushing away from the surface of the spline effectively. Now, just to show it. Well, let's see what it looks like when we hit play. You're going to see, oop, we're still bursting at the particles. Apologies. Let's zero that out. So now you're going to see that those particles are attracted to the line. Of course, we can always go in here, increase the radius, and now more will be attracted. And of course, we go to our direction and invert it, and those will push away. We've got our fall off where you can make that full strength. So now everything is full power, blow it, blast it away. All makes sense, consistent with everything else we've been doing. I'm going to go back to the default of inverted. So that's all working quite well. And I do want to point out that this is happening in three-dimensional space. We're just seeing a slice. So this is more of like a sausage type shape here. If we were to increase our depth, you're going to see that as this box gets bigger, we do have a 3D volumetric kind of bent capsule shape going on. And that is... it's just always important to keep in mind that this is a three-dimensional object, but we do want to go back to 2D for the simplicity. So this is going to attract objects or push them away. So that's very nice. But I think where this starts visually becoming most intuitive is if we set the distance mode to along, and actually, no, that's, I was going to say along in radius, but it actually doesn't work that well this way. Because in this way we could kind of combine them. Like you see, we can fade off as we go, but that is not what I want. I'm going to put this back to along. So now we're traveling along it. And remember, this is infinitely calculating. And I just want to be really clear here how this combines, because things get really interesting. We've got one arc, and it's saying, hey, that's the direction we want to travel. And that's cool. That's what I want. I want it to travel that direction. But I don't want it going off into infinity. This is not intuitive. So if we were to take this arc and create a mask, and then we drag the arc in a second time as a child of the mask. The second one, we're going to change the distance mode to radius. And now we have a radius traveling along the spline, but traveling in the orientation of the spline. So I start feeling like this is a little bit more intuitive. So we've still got our friction. I'm going to crank that up again to 100, so it's very strong. As our particles are created, you're going to see them try and travel along the spline, but only where we told the fall off to. Just to be clear, if we were to turn off our mask here, it's affecting everything everywhere. And while it is following the spline, it's, I don't know, there's just something about the way it feels. It doesn't feel intuitive. But you do this combination of travel along the spline, but limited to the radius of the spline. Now we're getting somewhere. Now we have control over this. So that is excellent. Now, just to throw out there a bunch of some more useful tips. Every time you add a new spline, you're going to have to manually make that rig again. Now, it's not as bad as all that, even if you were doing it this way. If I were to copy our arc, make a second one over there, and I'll scoot both of them down, we could go into our field force, and you can right-click on your object. You copy and paste, but you can also right-click and say duplicate, and now you get that rig again, and I could manually drag my arc and replace both of those arcs, and you can see it appear on the second one. Probably a good idea to rename this, but you can see how that has indeed updated a copy of it. So we've got that proper hierarchy set up, and now we have two different arcs, both traveling, working very nicely. Like I said, you can always go to one of the arcs and say reverse or unreverse this one. So those will travel up, those will travel down. Pretty cool. And okay, so that's working well, but that can start getting a little bit tedious. So what I really like doing, let's go to our field force. And you know what, let's just do this again from scratch, because why not? What I'm going to do is create a connect object, a good old connect. If we take a connect object, put both of these splines in as children, if we've only fed a connect splines, then it's going to kind of output itself as a spline. So with that in mind, we can go to our field forces and feed this connect in. It's going to ask us, is it a point object or a spline? I'm going to say, hey, it's a spline. And the instant we do that, you can see we've kind of got this overall shape, and it's got these two different arcs, so those go off to infinity, but when they collide, they split the difference. So that's what we're getting. We know that we want to increase our offset, so it's full power all the way. And that's pretty cool, where we get these two different directions. So just two splines combined is pretty neat. But now all we have to do is add the mask, and then add the connect again as a spline object. This time, instead of being along, it is the radius of it. We can change the radius. And what's really cool about doing this workflow is that, of course, we can keep on making more splines of the connect, and the rig is already looking for it. So along these lines, why don't we take this arc? It's going to be a little hard to identify them. I'm going to rotate this one a little bit, and let's place it right there. Oops, let me make sure I'm grabbing the correct axis. So there we go. One should feed into the other, and then let's make a duplicate of it again, and I'll rotate this, and we'll move it into position right there. So hopefully as these get to their end of their arc, they'll travel up. Now you'll see our display box, of course, is not showing everything because we don't have it big enough to see everything. But if we just know this arc is continuing to represent it, if we have play, we should see hopefully these travel into there. Then they'll travel up this line, and now they'll transition into that one. And they will continue traveling, even though we're not seeing these, the representation of it, they are still up there and they're still traveling. So this is where things start getting powerful and interesting. Now, continuing with the idea of these splines, we can make this even a little bit fancier. Now that we've got combined with our connect, it makes this even more simple. But we saw that before, the radius could attract or push away. So right now, if we have play, these are traveling along that line really well, but you'll see that they start getting a little bit left behind. If they escape the velocity, they're suddenly outside the radius, and then they're not being they're not being dragged along anymore. So let's see if we can fix that a little bit. Let's drag in another copy of the connect, and this time it will be a spline. Well, it will be a spline object again, but we're going to change the distance mode to radius, and now we've got a radius. But this time, let's make sure we match our radius. So you can see we have a radius of 23. I'm just going to copy that under our new connect. I'm going to make that radius the same, and now we have a completely separate iteration of this series of splines, but this one is attracting, or it might be pushing away. I forget the default. Let's hit play and find out. Okay, by default it's attracting it, but, and it's, I think it's mostly overriding it, but you're going to see a little bit how they are sort of traveling along it. Not very powerfully, but if we take this connect and add it to the system, then they're combining in a more complex way. So they're both getting attracted to the spline and traveling along the spline. And this, I think, is where you can really start to see the power of field forces. Like, look at this rig and how we are very powerfully, very specifically controlling these splines. Even look at this. The friction is slowing them down, but they're even overshooting this arc and then curving back in. I just love the way that that is combining into there. So this is where things start getting really interesting. And once again, just really clean splines that we have very, very direct control of. Keep in mind that we could be masking this, these could be masks of all sorts of other things. We could have an overall attractor pulling things into a center point, or they all get pulled to this point and then they travel around. We could, let's see, I bet we can just make a perfect loop here. I'm gonna make another copy of this arc, and let's make it a little bit funky, because why not? I'm gonna pull this one right there. We'll do something like that. T for scale, just scale it so it's about the right one. I'm just making this up as I go. So let's rotate this to match our position right about there. So with any luck, these should travel to the end there, and then those will get pulled down. Actually, it looks like they're traveling upward. So I'm going to reverse that arc, and now they're going to suddenly start getting sucked down. That one, you can see even how it does that nice little twirl, and they start traveling down. And then this should, it's going to overshoot, but this becomes a new loop for those to travel along. I guess if we made this new arc just a little bit smaller, it'd probably work a little bit better there. There we go. So we should have just made something of an infinite loop where these are going to travel around. This will hit the end and overshoot, and hopefully they'll get sucked down that pipe, and they'll just keep on traveling and traveling. So really, really cool. Now you see that these are really specific. They're really kind of latched onto this line. We could weaken the strength of the second copy of the connect. Like, this doesn't need to be nearly as strong. We could remap the fall off. We could make that incredibly strong. We could pull the strength of this down so it's attracting them, but not very much. You see by dropping this down to about a 20th that it's following the arc, but a lot less perfectly. That's less of a priority for them to arc inward. And keep in mind, the only thing we're doing is calculating different lines, different vectors. This is just the direction and the power of that direction when it gets calculated. So we could put this back up to full strength and have them follow the line very quickly or closely, but of course we could grab our random field. I'm going to drag that in. I'm going to set that to add, and this should start adding some extra variation on top of it. So I think these will probably start wiggling around a little bit, and these other ones will probably eventually catch our line. But we've got that extra wiggle, but in general, it's still going to try and follow these splines. So you can just see how it layers and layers and layers. Now they're all grouping up quite a bit. So instead of this randomness being big and wavy, why don't we take this randomness and we'll shrink the scale way down So we get this tiny little bit of randomness, and it's not very strong right now, so I'm going to increase its strength. We'll do that by going to its direction and starting to increase our scale. And now it's becoming more powerful. And now you can see that this randomness is making them just have that little bit of jitter. So they're not quite on top of each other as much. We can keep on increasing that even more. And now we're going to see that they're really going to start jittering around. And they're not quite so stuck on top of each other. Now you have to be careful, of course. Well, not careful, but the display mode here, as we increase the power, this might get a little bit crazy. But I still like seeing that feedback in the rig. And as we're started building something a little bit more complex here, this is why I don't like completely losing this. You see this mode, I don't feel like this is telling me too much information. If we leave it on line mode and we just start scaling this back, let's say 0.5, I guess 0.1 is probably a good number here. You can see that this is giving us a little bit more of that overall feedback. Although I guess these are being destroyed a little bit via the random field is so powerful that's kind of overriding these other ones. But you can still get a general vibe for them traveling around. And I do like getting that feedback. So some of them will escape. They do eventually randomly travel around, but in general, we get this really nice flow. And man, like what a powerful combination we have here. It's just so much fun. And I mean, we can just keep going and going with this. I'm going to delete all those splines. And we've already got that connect set up. So let's make a text object. And let's just say FF for field forces. I'm going to drop this in, and that these should automatically become the spline that's both being traveled along and attracted to and is the fall off. Back in our field force, I'm just going to delete this random field. And now you can see that we have all the fall off, everything set up there. So we hit play, and right away, not changing any of the settings, you have these traveling along, creating this letter. So you can see how quickly we could update this text. And you can even see it's doing a really good job of curving it around. If we increase the friction, of course, that would slow it down. But that is just working so incredibly well. I'm curious if we were to set this to set absolute velocity. I think it would travel these lines a lot more specifically. Oops, got to be careful on the power there. Yeah, these are traveling around, but very strongly, so that might be overdoing it. I was just curious what it would do. But you can see these are traveling along. If we were to visually hide this original text, we could grab our particles. We do have quite a few of them, so this might slow us down a little bit. Pause it, rewind. Let's create a MoGraph tracer object while our emitter is selected. It's automatically applied, hit play, and now it's going to trace those lines along the letter. You can see instantly the letters emerge. If we limited this from end, I finally remember which one of those to click on. Let's limit it to 11 frames. So now they're going to have little tails, and as these travel along, we're going to see the letters emerge. And let's see what, I always like putting an ampersand. That's a cool looking shape. So I'll make an ampersand. Look at that. Look at one letter just morphs into a new one by changing that. It might not always work that way, but let's change it to an X. And now any particles that are in range to get captured are going to start traveling around and revealing that new letter. So it's just really fun. There are so many ways of combining that. And I really love treating this stuff like it's a two-dimensional plane. It just makes it very direct, very controllable, and man, these combinations just get absolutely insane. So I think that will wrap up what we're talking about with splines there, and let's talk about the final thing to import as a non-field. There might be other ones, but let's import our final thing as a not field. And that is going to be a particle object. So let's just delete these. We don't need them anymore. And we still got our same setup we've just been using again and again and again. Let's, we might need that again, but whatever. I'm going to hit play. Now you see, boom, we get some particles. Nothing is being fed into them. Actually, those are all dead, so I'll kill them all off. Let's go ahead and start feeding in some particles. Now, I've actually found the particles to be a little less intuitive. Let's see what we can get. I'm actually going to copy and paste our entire emitter. Don't need, well, actually, we'll figure it out. We got a second emitter. And on the second emitter, I'm going to only emit about 100 particles, not for very long. And that all seems good. I'm going to say show objects that might be useful in a moment. So let's go to the basic tab, and I've got the color set. I'm going to just set this to something pretty bright, like a yellow. And let's see if we can see it. Oh, we probably need to also give it a different random seed. It's going to be a little difficult to see. But if I hit play, I think we'll probably be able to see a couple of yellow ones here. Let's, yeah, you can see that some yellow ones sprinkled in there. Not super easy to see, but they're there. So, let's have these do something. So they're already just kind of existing there, but you can imagine them passing through. We could have a lot of control. In fact, yeah, why not? I'm going to grab this emitter and let's make it 0 width. So we've got a single skinny line right there. And now I'm going to rotate this single skinny line. I'm going to spin it negative 90 degrees. And let's go ahead and give these some speed. So what should be happening, and is friction, yeah, we got friction. I'm going to turn friction off for now. Let's hit play, and we should see that we got a burst of yellow particles flying through. Cool. I think we can probably make these live for not too long, and I'm going to make them keep on emitting forever. So we got a bunch of particles, probably too many. I'm going to set it to 11, so it's a little more reasonable. There we go. Just a series of particles getting shot out. So let's have these start doing something. Well, the field forces, but let's actually do something really quickly. Let's make sure that we go to include in this new emitter that we made. And I'm going to say in the mode, I want to include nothing because I don't want the field force also affecting the emitter itself. That would be kind of creating a feedback loop, which we could totally do, but in this case, I want to keep it clean. So this is just kind of our, I'm going to call it REF, our reference emitter, and then here's the actual one that's going to be affected. Excellent. So I'm going to start shooting out some particles, and in the field force, we got nothing in there. Let's throw in our new emitter, and it's going to ask if we want it to be a particle object or a point object. Here's where I get a little bit lost, because if I hit play, oh, it is working this time. Cool. Okay, I get, maybe they have to be moving for the velocity. I'm not sure. But anyway, the instant I put it in here, you can see that these are doing something. They're actually making it so that there's a direction on it. Let's make this, did we shrink these? Yeah, I shrank my scale length. So let's zero that back out again. Now we can see it. So what's happening with these particles is they are actually creating a direction. This direction is pushing left. So instantly, pretty neat. We go to our field force, and there's our direction. Well, let's click on nice and slow. Let's not go too fast. Field force. Go to Object tab. Make sure we've got our reference emitter. Go to Layer, and here's what's being spit out. So currently, it's just got a radius. So I could increase or decrease this radius, and it's actually giving us a direction, and then that direction is making everything travel to the left. Now, we could go and say invert the direction, and now everything's going to travel to the right. So as these pass through these particles, it's going to start kind of dragging them along. So that right there, automatically, pretty neat. Now, unfortunately, that's kind of the only thing that we can do directly with these particles. We can make them go back where they came from, or we can make them push forward. I guess the only other thing that we can do, which is obviously pretty powerful, is we can do something like, let's create a solid. I'm going to tell the solid to go -1. So it's going to pull downward. And I'm going to set that to blending mode normal. And this, of course, is going to pull everything straight down. But let's go ahead and give it a mask. So there's a mask on the solid. It's going to reference the reference emitter. And now nothing is there unless it's in the radius of the reference emitter. And you'll see as these particles pass through, it's actually going to make them travel downward. So it's kind of creating these streaks of rain downward. So you can see how you can also use this as a layer mask. Now, we could, well, that's kind of the basics of what this does. It's pretty neat. You can build some neat rigs where things are getting blasted at it like that. But where I've kind of found things get a little bit more interesting was grabbing our emitter and emitting an object. If we emit an N side, I'm going to put it as a child, and I'm going to hit T for scale and scale it pretty far down. If we hit play, then we see them get emitted, and I can shrink it down. And let's also change the orientation so it's flat on our screen. 4th time's the charm. There we go. And I will create a couple of extra sides, so it's just very, very round. So now we are actually emitting these little circles. Now it's emitting pretty quickly right now. I'm going to slow it down. Let's drop the speed to about 1/3. And now we hit play. They're going to travel along. It's still making it rain because of the way we set that up. Let's delete the solid. And this time, actually, I'm not even sure. Let's do this as a quick experiment. I'm going to drag it in. I'm going to say, hey, look at this as a point object this time. I'm going to see if it does anything. No, it doesn't do anything I didn't think it would. But if we grab our reference emitter and we make it a child of a connect, and by the way, if you hold down the Alt key as you create it, it'll automatically make it as a parent. If we feed this in now, we can say, hey, view this connect as a spline object. And every single one of these circles now becomes a direction that we can see. So now if we go into our field force, we can click on that connect, which is the splines. Let's go ahead and do a somewhat similar rig to what we had before. In fact, I think we could say, don't make it a long, make it a radius. And now we get it attracting. Of course, this is attracting in a circle, and it's kind of like a donut shape because, there's an inside spline and outside spline. But if we grab our end side and we make it really small, I'm going to say 0.1. Now it's a really tiny circle. Maybe it's not a good idea to go that small. Or is the connect obliterating that? Actually, I'm kind of curious about that. I'm going to turn off weld in my connect, and let's make our radius 0.1 again. Oh, okay, cool. I didn't actually think the connect did anything to a spline, but it does, and it's good to know that. So I turned off weld, and now we can make a really tiny, essentially, circle inside of it. And then the circle is being viewed as a radius, so now these become attractors. These are now tiny little circles that are pulling these particles to them. So I think I would like to, a couple different things we can do. First of all, inside of our field force, let's make this a lot strong. Well, we can increase the radius. Let's also make it a lot stronger. I'm going to crank up the strength. You see it's going to get bigger. Now, of course, visually it's going to get in our way. So I'm going to temporarily set that to brightness. And let's see what this does. So now you can see it's very strongly pushing in. Of course, we can go into our effect and say, you know what? Actually, I want that to be inverted. So now these are pushing away the particles. It's going to be clearing a path as those come flying through. But I think if we turn on some friction here and re-invert the direction, we can get these getting attracted here, and they won't be going super crazy. They're just traveling a little bit quick right now, so let's slow these down again. Let's give them a speed of 5. So now these particles are going to be flying very slowly through here. They're very tiny, but as I enter, we can actually see them. It's so hard to see those. Like I said, I'm going to increase the life. I like being able to see the colorful one that just makes it pop more. So I'm going to say line length again, but we just, once again, have to scale it down. I wish there was a super quick way of doing it, but there we go. Now you can see we've got this wave of particles. Oh, it's even kind of cool. Look, as they pop, it's suddenly bursting them out, and they're flying to the next one. I wasn't even trying to do that, and that's a really cool effect. Suddenly, one will pop and travel to the next. So if we gave this a little bit more variation in the lifetime, I'm going to let them live a little bit longer, and I don't want there to be quite so many, so I'm going to drop it down to 3 and 3. And why don't we scoot this a little bit closer to the edge? So now these are being created, and they're going to attract the particles, and they should live for a very random length. And when they die, they're suddenly freed, and then they'll be captured by neighboring ones. It looks like we even need fewer particles than that, but that's pretty cool. Pop, and then that's a cool effect. We could give this a lot of variation in the speed as well. So we'll get some quicker ones and some slower ones. And yeah, I don't know how fast we can go before these would start escaping. But yeah, this is a neat little thing. And I think, yeah, it's still continuing to be two-dimensional. These are not traveling on Z at all, just because these particles are all flat on the same plane. But I just love these attractions, and then suddenly they pop and explode. So you can imagine, already this is starting to, it would inspire me to do some different additional effects that we might be able to create. It's just really fun. So many crazy combinations of different things. And keep in mind, every single thing that we've talked about could be layering on top of all the other things we've been talking about. These could all be in the simplest form. We can go back and add a solid. And I'm going to say, okay, I want to add the solid, and I want them all slowly traveling to -1. But I can just say -1, and now they'll all pull downward, but they'll be also captured by these particles. If it's too fast, I can also grab the opacity and pull that down, and now that won't be as powerful. Now those will slowly be getting sucked in there. If we didn't want the solid, we can delete that. We can also add in our friend, the random field. And let's set that to also add. And now these will be randomly blowing in all directions. It might be a little bit powerful, and it's probably in all 3 dimensions, so we might start losing them. But you can just start seeing where these could start combining and capturing and traveling along splines. It gets absolutely insane. So I think there's probably a couple more things to talk about. But let me show you a more advanced rig of combining a bunch of these ideas. And I've already got a scene file prepped here. Let's go ahead and pop it open. And here we go. We've got the dinosaur rig from Sebastian from the content browser, just something that we can tinker around with. And I've got a bunch of different things prepped here. We're going to be feeding this in as a way of controlling it. So let's just take a look at the way we set up our field force. First of all, I got the field force moved into a new position, so it's laying flat on the ground, so we can see that. And then I've got this emitter, which is going to be emitting particles, and you can see the dinosaur is animated to walk. Now, we already talked about how the surface of a mesh will slow it down a lot. So I don't want to slow it down by using this entire dinosaur to be calculating where the surface is. So what I set up is I took a copy of this model inside of it and I deleted everything except for a little bit of the geometry on the feet. So it doesn't have to calculate everything. It's just looking at the feet. And that is what I was going to feed into our field force. I got two different field forces. So we got our field force here. So let's go over what some of these are actually doing. We'll kind of work our way up step by step. So first of all, I made a solid on the bottom. And what this one is doing is it's pushing everything up, but it's only pushing things up that are on one side of this linear field. Not really something we talked about, but if you make a linear field, which is just, kind of a fall off, it's 0 power on one side and full power on the opposite one. So if you take this and you shrink it down, actually go to the length and we shrink it down. You don't want to go to 0, that can confuse it, but we shrink this down to 1, then stuff will happen on one side and not the other, and we can use that as some sort of mask. And that is exactly what's happening in the field force, where everything below the ground is getting a force that says no, push upward. So in the beginning, nothing will happen. And then there's another solid. And what this solid is doing is it's saying, hey, everything should travel upward, not quite as fast, but it has a mask based on the feet of the dinosaur, and it's just looking at the points. So it's just looking at the radius to calculate very quickly. And then as soon as anything kind of goes a little bit above the ground, then there's suddenly a big random field that can take over and blow everything in lots of different directions. So let's just take a look at what we actually get combining all these things. So let's hit play. And now when the dinosaur takes a step, its feet are suddenly being detected inside of the field. And these particles are getting raised upward. As soon as they go upward a little bit, the randomness is taking over and they're all kind of wafting through the air. There's all sorts of additional things we could do as far as having them fall back to the ground or have a wisp for a little while. Lots of different combinations. One additional thing that was neat was I dragged in the foot of the dinosaur a second time, and I have it set to surface. Now this will be a little bit slower because it's still calculating that surface, but this is actually calculating to push everything away. So while it's a little bit slower, you'll see when the step goes in, it actually does a better job. If we get really up close here, it's bursting all the particles kind of to the left and to the right downward, but those downward ones will get pushed back up again, and the foot would be blocking it. So you kind of get this nice burst of stuff as it stomps down. And it was pretty quick to put this together. But hopefully you can see kind of what I was talking about, where this is all about doing this methodically. You have to have a plan. You can't just throw things at it. I mean, it's fun to tinker. It's fun to play around and see what it does. But when it finally comes to building a rig, you want to be very precise. And that is what this setup is. So it is actually relatively clean and simple, but you get these great stomps with a burst of these particles all traveling up, and it's just a lot of fun. Just so many different ways of combining this stuff. So we got our dino making this nice splashy footprints. Whoop, almost forgot one thing. So we're feeding this mesh several times into our field force, but sometimes a deformed mesh doesn't want to be acknowledged by field force, and sometimes some other objects. Now, when in doubt, put something into a connect object, but sometimes even the connect object won't work. And something I have found that I usually will try if that type of deformation isn't working is I will try feeding in a correction deformer. That's another deformer we have in here. But if you feed that in, it's kind of, it outputs every single point, and oftentimes that will be acknowledged. So something that's pretty cool is even though the mesh didn't work being fed into the field force, what did work was dragging the correction deformer in, and it's acknowledged just like a polygon object, and that works perfectly. All right, so there we go. Hopefully you feel like you have a better understanding now of field forces and how they work and how they're integrated into Cinema 4D. Now, I didn't go into everything. Obviously, the video was already over an hour long. We didn't go at all into the volume builder and the vector mode, which is pretty cool, but also pretty advanced and very specific. So that will be covered in the future. But I think we hit a lot of things I would have really wanted to get across. Now, one tiny little bit of news. Rocket Lasso Live is going to be coming back online. I think on January 8th will be the premiere of season 2. If you're not familiar, Rocket Lasso Live is a live stream done through YouTube and on Twitch on Wednesdays where I take live questions from the chat in Cinema 4D and we try and recreate things or answer questions and just figure things out. It's a lot of fun and I highly recommend coming and checking it out if you like this kind of Cinema 4D content. So if you like this video, any kind of sharing would be super appreciated. But other than that, I think that should wrap this up. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. It 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 makes me think a little bit of like